Yes, thank you for offering me this chance to say something on this panel, which, not having read the book, obviously, I don't know if it's still written, but it certainly hasn't been read. I'm not sure what you say, but on the basis of the presentation, let me say a couple of things. One is I agree with Mary and also indeed with Donal, that I think this came through yesterday too, that the problem of accountability is a huge problem. But it's the accountability of the government rather than the accountability of our representatives. As I tried to say yesterday, we hold our representatives very accountable and we control them very closely. But in doing so, we neglect to control our governments. So any second republic, any reform has to deal with that. And I think one of the point which Donal makes about the separation of powers, a sort of Dutch model of government, is a very good way towards that and towards the future. We also need more participation. That is clear. We have a very passive citizenry in Ireland. We have a very passive politics in Ireland. And we need to get more engagement. We need to get more involvement of citizens. But one of the things where we also need much more accountability and much more engagement is at the European level. And we talk about global pressures and we talk about European pressures. But we have a huge constraint on any second republic, on any choices which we make. We have a huge constraint being imposed by Europe. And while we talk about governments engaging with Europe, and ministers engaging with Europe, and political leaders engaging with Europe, we talk very, very little and see very, very little opportunity for citizens to engage in Europe and for citizens to hold Europe accountable. I'm much less optimistic than Mary or than Peter probably about the choices facing our society or facing any society in Europe at the moment. I think an awful lot of our choices are constrained by the past, by path dependency, by the debts we've built up which limit government manoeuvre, but also by the constraints imposed by the European Central Bank, by the European Commission and by the European political order. There's very little real freedom which nation states have now. There are differences between European political systems, but European political systems have very little choice about the paths which they follow. The differences are there, but you can't choose to do something else. You can't choose to be like Sweden, or you can't choose to be like Norway, or you can't choose, luckily enough, to be like Italy. So you are constrained and bound within a set of parameters, and a lot of those parameters are established by Europe. So one of the key things we have to do is not just talk about more accountability, and one of the things we have to do is not just achieve more accountability and more participation at the national level. We must achieve more accountability and more participation at the European level. That is one of the essential things. The third point I'll make is, and this is very, very briefly, is that, again, I agree with Mary and Peter, is that we can't go back to, and we shouldn't go back to, although we may have no choice, but go back to the neoliberal model. One of the most striking things you can see from which sociologists and economists and political economists have shown us in the last 10 years and the last 20 years is that with the triumph of neoliberalism, with the retreat of the state, what we have seen everywhere, in every European society, in every advanced society, especially indeed in the United States, is growing inequality. The rich have become not only richer, but they have much more control over the future of their societies than the poor. The gap between rich and poor is widening all the time. And that gap between rich and poor is partly determined by family circumstances. And family circumstances, whether it's to do with the income which a family enjoys, whether it's the education which the children enjoy, which we talked about yesterday, all of these things are determined by wealth and by status, and by the choices of people who have privileges and who have wealth and resources. Neoliberalism has allowed the privatization of resources and the privatization of wealth and the privatization of opportunity. It has exacerbated inequality. So unless neoliberalism is turned back or restricted, unless the state really begins to control the market for the benefit of society rather than controlling society for the benefit of the market, unless we can get somewhere like that at either national or European level, we're in a bad situation. Thank you.